the North Atlantic, March 1943. The ocean stretched endlessly in every direction, cold and gray under heavy clouds. Below the surface, death prowled in silence. German submarines, the dreaded U-boats, hunted Allied merchant ships with ruthless efficiency. In the first 3 months of that year alone, they would send over 300 vessels to the bottom of the sea, taking thousands of lives and millions of tons of desperately needed supplies with them. But inside the cramped compartments of Allied escort ships, a new kind of warrior was changing the tide of this underwater war. These men wore no medals for marksmanship. They had never fired a gun in anger. Many had never even been to sea before the war. Yet they possessed a weapon more powerful than any torpedo or depth charge. They possessed extraordinary ears. This is the story of how musicians, with their unique ability to hear what others could not, became the unsung heroes of the Battle of the Atlantic. It is a story of sound and silence, of technology and human intuition, of how the trained ear of a violinist or pianist could mean the difference between life and death for thousands of sailors. The crisis in the Atlantic. To understand why musicians became so crucial to the war effort, we must first understand the desperate situation the Allies faced in the early years of World War II. When war erupted in September 1939, the United States Navy had only 60 destroyers equipped with anti-submarine devices. By December 1941, when America entered the war, that number had grown to just 170 destroyers. These ships faced an impossible task, protecting the vital supply lines that stretched across the Atlantic Ocean, carrying men, food, ammunition, and equipment to Britain and beyond. The statistics were staggering and terrifying. In 1940, German U-boats were sinking an average of 80 Allied ships each month. By the end of 1942, that number had climbed to 143 ships per month. Along America's eastern seaboard, merchant vessels were being torpedoed within sight of the coast. Families standing on beaches could sometimes see the orange glow of burning ships on the horizon, hear the distant thunder of explosions. The U-boat commanders called this period the happy time. For the Allies, it was a nightmare. Ships were being destroyed faster than they could be replaced. If the trend continued, Britain would be starved into submission. The Soviet Union would collapse without American supplies. The war would be lost before it truly began. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the German submarine fleet, believed he could win the war with his underwater wolves. His strategy was simple and brutal. Sink 700,000 tons of Allied shipping each month. At that rate, Britain would run out of food, fuel, and ammunition within months. The mathematics of destruction were on his side. But the Allies had a secret weapon, though they did not fully realize it yet. That weapon was sound. The science of sound. Beneath the waves, long before the war, scientists had discovered something remarkable about the ocean. While water blocks light, making vision impossible beyond a few dozen feet, it conducts sound beautifully. Sound waves travel through water more than 4 times faster than through air. A noise made on one side of the ocean can, under the right conditions, be heard on the other side. This discovery led to the development of sonar, an acronym that would not be coined until late in World War II. Sound navigation and ranging. The British called their version ASDIC, named after the anti-submarine division that developed it during the First World War. The principle was elegant. A ship-mounted device would send out a pulse of sound, a ping, into the water. If that sound wave struck a solid object, it would bounce back as an echo. By measuring the time it took for the echo to return, operators could calculate the distance to the object. By noting the direction from which the echo returned, they could determine its bearing. In theory, it was perfect. In practice, it was maddeningly difficult. The ocean is not empty. Sound bounces off temperature layers where warm and cold water meet. It reflects from schools of fish. It echoes from rock formations on the seafloor. Whales produce sounds that can mimic submarine engines. The ship's own propellers create a constant roar that drowns out faint echoes. And submarines, those steel predators, did everything they could to hide. They dove deep below the effective range of sonar beams. They moved slowly to reduce engine noise. They used the ocean's temperature layers as shields, hiding in shadow zones where sound could not reach. German engineers designed special rubber coatings that absorbed sonar pulses rather than reflecting them. The technology existed to detect submarines, but technology alone was not enough. What was needed was something that could not be built in a factory or drawn on a blueprint. What was needed was the human ear, trained to an extraordinary degree of sensitivity. What was needed were musicians. The discovery, the revelation came gradually through observation and desperate necessity. Sonar operators sat for hours in darkened rooms, wearing headphones, listening to the endless symphony of the ocean. Ping. They would send out a pulse. Then they would wait, straining to hear the return echo amid the cacophony of background noise. Was that faint sound a submarine or just a school of fish? Was that change in pitch a U-boat maneuvering or simply a quirk of water temperature? The Navy quickly discovered that not all men were equally suited to this work. Some could sit for hours and hear nothing but noise. Others seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to pick out the faint signature of a distant submarine from the chaos of sound. As commanders compared notes, a pattern emerged. The best sonar operators, the ones who could consistently detect submarines that others missed, had something in common. Many of them had been musicians in civilian life. There was the young man from Philadelphia who had played violin in a symphony orchestra. He could detect minute changes in the frequency of returning echoes, variations so subtle that other operators dismissed them as imagination. Those tiny shifts in pitch caused by the Doppler effect as submarines moved gave away the enemy's position and speed. There was the piano teacher from Boston who could identify individual submarines by the unique sound of their engines, the way a musician can identify different instruments in an orchestra. Each boat had its own acoustic signature, its own voice. He knew them all. There was the jazz drummer from New Orleans who could separate overlapping echoes the way he could pick out individual instruments in a band. While other operators heard only confused noise, he heard distinct sounds layered on top of each other, each telling its own story. The connection was clear. Musicians possessed exactly the skills needed for sonar operation. Their years of training had developed their ability to distinguish subtle differences in pitch, to separate one sound from many, to maintain focus through long periods of intense listening. What seemed like magic to others was, for them, simply an extension of their musical training. The Navy acted quickly. Word went out to recruitment centers across the country. Find the musicians, test them, send the best ones to sonar school. The tests. The selection process was unlike anything the military had done before. These were not tests of physical strength or combat skills. These were tests of the ear, of the mind's ability to process sound. At recruitment centers, potential sonar operators faced a battery of musical aptitude tests. They sat in soundproof booths, wearing headphones as technicians played sequences of tones through the equipment. Can you hear the difference between these two pitches? Which tone is higher? Can you identify this interval? Can you reproduce this rhythm? The tests grew progressively more difficult. Two tones would be played simultaneously. Can you hear them both? Can you tell them apart? Multiple sounds would overlap. How many can you distinguish? Which one changed? Some tests used recordings of actual sonar echoes. Here is the sound of a submarine. Here is the sound of a whale. Here is the sound of a school of fish. Can you tell the difference? Now we will play them with interference, with background noise, with the sound of the ship's own engines. Can you still pick out the submarine? The Navy also administered psychological tests. Sonar operators needed more than good ears. They needed the temperament to sit for hours in isolation, maintaining perfect concentration, never letting their attention waver. A moment of distraction could mean a missed contact, a ship torpedoed, hundreds of lives lost. They needed the mental resilience to handle enormous stress. When a sonar operator detected a submarine, the entire ship went to battle stations. Depth charges would be prepared. The captain would rely absolutely on the sonar operator's information to guide the attack. If the operator was wrong, if the echo was just a whale or a false return, depth charges would be wasted. If the operator missed a real submarine because he doubted himself, the ship itself might be torpedoed. The pass rate was low. Many skilled musicians failed because they could not handle the pressure. Others had the temperament but lacked the necessary auditory acuity. The Navy was looking for a rare combination of abilities. Those who passed faced an intensive training program, unlike anything else in the military. Sonar School. The Navy established fleet sonar schools at San Diego on the Pacific Coast and Key West in Florida. Here, the selected men learned to transform their musical abilities into weapons of war. The training began with the basics. Students learned the physics of sound, how it travels through water, how temperature and salinity affect its propagation. They studied submarine construction, learning to recognize the acoustic signatures of different types of boats. They memorized the sounds of Allied ships so they would not mistake friendly vessels for enemy submarines. But the heart of the training was listening. Hour after hour, day after day, the students sat in mock-up sonar compartments, wearing headphones, training their ears. They learned to distinguish between active sonar echoes and the countless sounds that filled the ocean. The hiss of rain on the surface, the crack and groan of ice, the songs of whales, eerily similar to mechanical sounds, the pop and click of shrimp so loud it could mask a submarine's presence, the rumble of undersea earthquakes, the whisper of currents flowing over rock formations. They learned to hear what others could not hear. An echo so faint it was almost lost in the background noise. A change in pitch so subtle it barely registered on the instruments. A pattern in the randomness, a signature of something artificial amid the natural sounds of the sea. The instructors used recordings of actual submarine contacts, captured during combat operations. "Listen to this," they would say. "This is a U-boat at 2,000 yards moving at 6 knots. Study this sound. Remember it. Your life and the lives of your shipmates will depend on recognizing it instantly, under pressure, when your hands are shaking and your heart is pounding." The training included practical exercises at sea. Students would go out on patrol boats, operating real sonar equipment, hunting for friendly submarines, playing the role of enemy boats. They learned to operate under realistic conditions, with the roll and pitch of the ship, the noise of the engines, the confusion of multiple contacts. They learned about the Doppler shift, the change in frequency that occurs when a submarine moves toward or away from the sonar beam. A musician's ear, trained to detect minute changes in pitch, was perfect for this task. The direction and speed of that frequency change could tell an experienced operator not just where a submarine was, but where it was going and how fast. They trained with sound classification equipment, learning to match what they heard in their headphones with what they saw on paper traces and oscilloscope screens. The best operators developed an almost instinctive understanding of the relationship between the visual and auditory signals. They learned to communicate clearly and quickly under pressure, translating what they heard into precise information the captain could use. Contact bearing 095, range 1,800 yards, moving left. The captain needed to know exactly where the submarine was, where it was going, and how fast. A sonar operator who could not communicate clearly was useless, no matter how good his ears were. The training typically lasted 6 weeks, though some students required additional time. It was intense, exhausting, and absolutely essential. When a sonar operator graduated and reported to his ship, he was expected to perform flawlessly from day one. There was no time for on-the-job training in the middle of the Atlantic with U-boats hunting the convoy. Life at sea. For the sonar operators who made it through training and joined the fleet, life at sea was a strange mixture of boredom and terror. Much of their time was spent in the sonar compartment, a cramped space filled with equipment, listening to the endless monotony of the ocean. Ping, wait, listen, ping, wait, listen. Hour after hour, watch after watch, the routine never changed. The compartment was deliberately kept dark. Bright lights would ruin the operator's night vision, making it harder for them to read the dim glow of the equipment displays. In the darkness, with headphones covering their ears, sonar operators existed in a world of sound, isolated from the rest of the ship. They learned to recognize the acoustic environment around their vessel. Every ship had its own acoustic personality. The rhythm of the engines, the particular creak and groan of the hull working in heavy seas, the splash of the bow wave, the rumble of the propellers. An experienced operator could identify his own ship by sound alone. They learned the sounds of their convoy. Each merchant ship had a distinctive acoustic signature. The sonar operator could map the convoy by ear, knowing which ships were where without looking at a chart. If one of those familiar sounds suddenly changed or disappeared, he knew immediately that something was wrong. The work was mentally exhausting. Maintaining absolute concentration for hours required enormous mental discipline. The consequences of a lapse in attention were too terrible to contemplate. Every minute, the operator knew that somewhere in the dark water around the convoy, U-boats might be lurking. One missed contact could mean the difference between a successful crossing and disaster. Sleep was often difficult. Even off watch, sonar operators found themselves listening, their brains unable to shut off the processing of sound. Some developed a condition the Navy doctors called acoustic fatigue, a kind of auditory exhaustion where the ear and brain became temporarily less sensitive to sound. But when contact was made, when that distinctive echo finally came back through the headphones, everything changed in an instant. The hunt. The moment a sonar operator detected a possible submarine contact, he would press the general alarm. The harsh clang of the bell would echo through the ship. Battle stations, all hands to battle stations. Men would drop whatever they were doing and rush to their assigned positions. The ship would come alive with controlled chaos. The captain would appear in the sonar compartment, leaning over the operator's shoulder. "What do you have?" The operator would report what he heard, translating the sounds in his headphones into actionable intelligence. Contact bearing 270, range 2,000 yards, moving right. Estimated speed 8 knots. The captain would order a change of course, maneuvering the ship to maintain sonar contact. The operator's job became more critical with every passing second. He had to track the submarine continuously, updating the captain on any changes in bearing, range, or speed. This required extraordinary skill. The operator had to distinguish the submarine's echo from the echo of the ocean floor, from temperature layers, from schools of fish, from the turbulence created by the ship's own propellers. He had to compensate mentally for the ship's movement, for the changing angle of the sonar beam, for the distortion caused by water conditions. His musician's training came into play in ways he had never imagined. The subtle change in pitch that indicated the submarine was turning away. The slight variation in echo strength that suggested the boat was diving deeper. The distinctive pattern that meant the submarine was trying to hide behind a temperature layer. All of these tiny clues, barely perceptible even on the best equipment, could be heard by an ear trained to musical perfection. As the range closed, the tension would mount. At 1,500 yards, the captain would order depth charges prepared. At 1,000 yards, the attack team would be ready. At 500 yards, the sonar operator would begin the final approach. This was the most difficult part. As the range decreased, the sonar operator had less time between pings to calculate the submarine's position. The margin for error shrank with every yard. If his calculations were off by even a few degrees, if his range estimation was wrong by 50 yards, the attack would fail. At 300 yards, something terrible would happen. The submarine would pass beneath the sonar beam, vanishing from the operator's acoustic picture. For the final approach, the ship would be blind, running on the last position the operator had calculated. The captain would give the order. Fire! The depth charges would roll off the stern, sinking toward the calculated position of the submarine. The sonar operator would count the seconds, knowing that if he had done his job perfectly, those charges would explode within range of the submarine. If he had made a mistake, the submarine would escape, free to torpedo another ship. The explosions, when they came, were felt through the entire ship, a series of hammering shock waves that rattled equipment and shook the deck beneath the crew's feet. The sonar operator would rip off his headphones, the sound of the nearby explosions too loud for the sensitive equipment. Then, as the water settled, he would put them back on and listen. Sometimes he would hear the terrible sounds of a submarine dying, the screech of tearing metal, the roar of air escaping from ruptured tanks, the creak and groan of a hull collapsing under pressure. And sometimes, if the operator's hearing was exceptionally acute, he might hear something worse, the sound of men shouting, of hammering on metal, the last desperate sounds of submariners trying to escape their flooding tomb. Other times, there would be nothing. Silence. The submarine had escaped, slipping away in the chaos of the explosions, or perhaps it had never been there at all, just a false echo that had sent everyone to battle stations for nothing. Success or failure, the operator would return to his routine. Ping, wait, listen. Searching for the next contact, knowing that the U-boats never stopped hunting, that the battle never truly ended until the convoy reached port. The technology evolves. As the war progressed, sonar technology became more sophisticated. But rather than making the operators less important, these advances made their skills even more critical. New equipment could display sonar returns visually, showing the operator not just what the sound looked like, but what it sounded like. The best operators learned to use both their ears and their eyes, cross-checking auditory information against visual displays, catching contacts that might be missed by relying on either sense alone. The introduction of the Doppler system automated some of the frequency shift detection, using electronic circuits to measure the change in pitch of returning echoes. But the operators quickly learned that the equipment was not infallible. A trained musical ear could detect Doppler shifts that the equipment missed, could distinguish between the shift caused by a submarine's movement and false shifts caused by water conditions or equipment problems. British scientists developed improved sonar domes, enclosures that protected the sonar transducer from turbulence while the ship was moving. This allowed ships to maintain sonar contact at higher speeds, up to 25 knots in good conditions. For the operators, this meant processing information faster, tracking contacts while the ship was maneuvering aggressively, maintaining concentration while the deck pitched and rolled beneath them. Allied scientists discovered that the ocean was far more complex than anyone had realized. Temperature layers created shadow zones where sonar could not penetrate. The deep scattering layer, a mysterious zone of echoes that appeared to rise and fall with the sun, confused inexperienced operators. The thermocline, the boundary between warm surface water and cold deep water, could bend sonar beams in unexpected ways. Sonar operators had to understand all of this, had to compensate mentally for these acoustic phenomena. The best operators developed an intuitive feel for the ocean's acoustic structure, learning to predict how sound would behave under different conditions. This knowledge, combined with their musical training, made them invaluable. New training techniques were developed. Sound classification trainers allowed operators to practice with recorded submarine sounds, learning to identify different types of boats by their acoustic signatures. German submarines sounded different from Allied boats. A diesel engine had a different signature than an electric motor. A submarine on the surface sounded nothing like one submerged. Operators learned that individual submarines had unique acoustic fingerprints. A boat with a damaged propeller produced a distinctive irregular beat. An older boat with worn bearings had a characteristic whine. Some operators became so skilled that they could identify specific enemy submarines, tracking the same boat across multiple encounters, learning its captain's tactics by the way the submarine maneuvered. The bubble screen deception. The Germans were not passive targets. They constantly developed new tactics to defeat Allied sonar. One of the most effective was the bubble screen. A submarine under attack would release compressed air or special chemicals that created a cloud of bubbles. Sonar waves would bounce off these bubbles just as they would bounce off a solid target, creating false echoes that confused operators and wasted depth charges. The first time Allied operators encountered this tactic, it was devastatingly effective. Ships would track a contact, launch an attack, and listen triumphantly as their sonar showed direct hits on the target. Only later would they realize they had attacked nothing but bubbles while the submarine escaped. But the operators learned. They discovered that bubble screens had their own acoustic signature, subtly different from a real submarine. A musician's ear could hear the difference. The echo from bubbles had a certain quality, a softness, that was distinct from the hard metallic return of a submarine's hull. More importantly, operators learned to detect the Doppler shift. A cloud of bubbles, even if it was drifting with the current, did not produce the characteristic change in frequency that came from a moving submarine. A stationary target might be bubbles. A moving one was almost certainly a boat. The sonar operators shared this knowledge through an informal network. When ships met in convoy, operators would gather to compare notes, sharing tricks and techniques. A man who had successfully distinguished between bubbles and submarines would explain exactly what he had heard, what subtle clues had given away the deception. This knowledge spread through the fleet, passed from ear to ear, making every operator more effective. The Germans introduced acoustic torpedoes that homed on the sound of a ship's propellers. Allied scientists countered with towed noisemakers called Foxers, devices that made loud sounds to decoy the torpedoes away from the vulnerable propellers. But this created a new problem. The Foxers made so much noise that they interfered with the ship's own sonar. Operators had to learn to hear through the cacophony, distinguishing submarine echoes from the deliberate noise of their own countermeasures. It was like trying to hear a whisper in a thunderstorm. Only the most skilled operators could do it consistently. The tide turns. By mid-1943, the Battle of the Atlantic had reached its crisis point. That spring, in a single month, Allied forces sank 41 German submarines. It was a turning point. Admiral Dönitz, facing unsustainable losses, was forced to withdraw his U-boats from the North Atlantic convoy routes. The defeat of the U-boats was due to many factors. Better radar allowed ships to detect surfaced submarines at night. Long-range patrol aircraft could cover vast expanses of ocean. Improved depth charges and ahead-throwing weapons like the Hedgehog made attacks more deadly. Intelligence from broken German codes allowed convoys to avoid U-boat concentrations. But underlying all of these advances was the skill of the sonar operators. Every successful attack began with detection. Before a depth charge could be dropped, before an aircraft could be vectored to a contact, someone had to hear the submarine in the first place. That someone was usually a young man wearing headphones, his musician's ears trained to an extraordinary degree of sensitivity, capable of hearing what others could not. The statistics tell the story. In early 1942, Allied success in pursuing submarines despite successful detection was less than 5%. By 1944, that figure had risen dramatically. The sonar operators were not just detecting more submarines, they were providing more accurate information, allowing more effective attacks. Ships equipped with experienced sonar operators had significantly higher success rates than those with green crews. A skilled operator could maintain contact through a submarine's evasive maneuvers, could track a boat through temperature layers and bubble screens, could provide the steady stream of accurate information that captains needed to press home a successful attack. The impact extended beyond individual contacts. The mere presence of effective sonar forces changed U-boat tactics. Submarines that once roamed boldly on the surface were forced to stay submerged, reducing their speed and range. Boats that once attacked aggressively from close range were forced to make hasty attacks from greater distances, reducing their accuracy. The psychological pressure on U-boat crews mounted as they realized the ocean was no longer a safe hiding place. By D-Day, in June 1944, the sonar screen maintained around the invasion fleet was so effective that not a single Allied ship was lost to German submarines during the critical days of the Normandy landings. The Battle of the Atlantic had been decisively won, and the ability to detect and track submarines was a crucial factor in that victory. Individual stories. Behind the statistics were individual human beings, young men who had never imagined that their musical training would become a weapon of war. There were operators who sat at their posts through multiple depth charge attacks on their own ships, maintaining concentration even as explosions rocked the vessel, never losing contact with the enemy submarine that was trying to end their lives. Their hands would be shaking, their hearts pounding, adrenaline flooding their systems, but their ears remained steady, translating sound into information. There were operators who detected submarines at ranges that seemed impossible, picking out faint echoes that were barely distinguishable from background noise. When asked how they knew it was a submarine, they often could not explain. They just knew, the same way a musician knows when a note is slightly out of tune, even if they cannot articulate exactly why. There were operators who maintained their posts during weather so terrible that other crew members were being washed overboard, who continued listening through storms that threatened to tear their ships apart, because submarines often attacked during bad weather when sonar conditions were at their worst. There were operators who suffered permanent hearing damage from spending too many hours with headphones pressed tight against their ears, who continued to serve despite growing deafness because their skills were too valuable to lose, who would eventually return home unable to enjoy the music that had defined their lives. There were operators who made mistakes, who missed contacts that resulted in ships being torpedoed, who lived with the knowledge that their error had cost lives. The burden of responsibility was enormous. Every decision, every interpretation of a sound could mean the difference between life and death for hundreds of people. There were operators who correctly identified submarines but were overruled by captains who did not trust the information, who had to watch helplessly as opportunities for attack were lost because someone higher in the chain of command did not believe what the sonar man's ears were telling him. There were operators who survived their ships being torpedoed, who found themselves in the water, listening to the sounds of their vessel breaking apart and sinking, who were haunted for the rest of their lives by those terrible sounds. There were operators who served together for years, developing an almost telepathic understanding, able to hand off a contact seamlessly during a change of watch, maintaining continuous tracking of a submarine through shifts in personnel. There were operators who trained new men, passing on their skills and knowledge, creating a legacy that would extend long after the war ended. The techniques they developed, the understanding they gained about acoustic detection, would form the foundation for Cold War sonar operations and continue to influence submarine warfare to this day. After the war. When the war ended in 1945, many sonar operators returned to civilian life and tried to resume their musical careers. But the war had changed them in ways both subtle and profound. Some found that years of intense listening to mechanical sounds had affected their musical perception. They could no longer enjoy certain types of music, certain frequencies or rhythms, triggered memories of submarine contacts, of depth charge attacks, of ships exploding. A low rumbling bass could sound too much like submarine engines. A high-pitched sound could mimic the whine of sonar equipment. Others found that their hearing had been permanently damaged. The hours spent with headphones, the exposure to loud sounds from depth charge explosions, even through hearing protection, the acoustic fatigue from years of intense listening, all took their toll. Some experienced tinnitus, a constant ringing in their ears. Others suffered partial deafness in certain frequency ranges. But many also found that their war experience had deepened their understanding of sound in unexpected ways. They heard the world differently, more acutely aware of subtle acoustic phenomena. They could identify sounds that others missed, distinguish between similar sounds with uncanny accuracy. These skills, developed in the life and death struggle of submarine warfare, sometimes enhanced their musical abilities in surprising ways. Some operators found they could not return to music at all. The association between sound and survival, between acoustic perception and combat, was too strong. They moved into other fields, carrying their sonar experience with them. Some became acoustic engineers, applying their knowledge to civilian sonar development for fishing fleets, oceanographic research, or underwater exploration. Others became audio engineers in the emerging recording industry, their trained ears perfect for the detailed work of sound production. A few continued to serve in the Navy, becoming instructors at sonar schools, trainers for the new generation of operators who would face the Soviet submarine threat during the Cold War. Their wartime experience was invaluable, their skills irreplaceable. The Navy recognized the importance of selecting personnel with musical aptitude for sonar duties. The recruitment and testing programs developed during World War II became standard practice, refined and improved, but following the same basic principle. Find people with extraordinary ears and train them to hear submarines. The designation changed over the years. The early soundmen became sonarmen, then sonar technicians. But the requirements remained essentially the same. Strong performance in science and mathematics, the ability to qualify for a security clearance, and most importantly, exceptional hearing and the ability to distinguish between different sounds. Musical training or experience was considered a significant advantage. The science behind the skill, modern research into the neuroscience of music, has helped explain why musicians made such excellent sonar operators. Musical training creates specific changes in the brain. Areas responsible for auditory processing become more developed. The connection between hearing and motor control, between listening and analysis, becomes stronger. Musicians develop enhanced ability to detect pitch differences, to separate simultaneous sounds, to track multiple auditory streams at once. These are exactly the skills required for effective sonar operation. The ability to detect minute changes in frequency allowed musicians to hear the Doppler shift that indicated a submarine's movement. The ability to separate sounds let them distinguish a submarine echo from background noise. The ability to track multiple sounds simultaneously helped them maintain contact while processing information from multiple sonar beams or displays. Musical training also develops sophisticated pattern recognition abilities. Musicians learn to recognize complex patterns of sound, to predict how a musical phrase will develop, to notice when something deviates from the expected pattern. These same skills allowed sonar operators to recognize the acoustic signature of a submarine, to notice when a contact behaved in an unusual way, to distinguish between the expected sounds of the ocean and the unexpected intrusion of something artificial. The discipline required for musical mastery translated well to the demands of sonar operation. Both require intense concentration over long periods. Both demand attention to minute details while maintaining awareness of the overall picture. Both benefit from the ability to remain calm under pressure, to maintain performance quality even when exhausted or stressed. Research has also shown that musicians have enhanced auditory memory. They can remember and compare sounds with greater accuracy than non-musicians. This ability was crucial for sonar operators who needed to recognize individual submarines by their acoustic signatures, to remember the sound characteristics of different types of contacts, to distinguish between sounds they had heard before and new, potentially dangerous sounds. Perhaps most importantly, musicians develop what researchers call selective attention for sound. They can focus on one specific sound while ignoring others, can shift their attention rapidly between different sounds, can maintain awareness of multiple sounds simultaneously without becoming confused. These abilities are essential for operating in the complex acoustic environment of submarine warfare. Legacy and impact. The use of musicians as sonar operators during World War II had lasting impacts that extended far beyond the immediate needs of the war. The program demonstrated the value of selecting personnel based on specific cognitive abilities rather than traditional military criteria. The Navy's success with musical aptitude testing influenced personnel selection practices across all branches of the military and eventually in civilian contexts as well. The intensive training programs developed for sonar operators became models for other technical specialties. The combination of theoretical knowledge, practical skill development, and realistic simulation under stress would be copied in training programs for radar operators, communications specialists, and eventually for the complex sensor operators on modern warships. The acoustic knowledge gained during the war laid the foundation for the sophisticated anti-submarine warfare systems developed during the Cold War. The techniques for detecting, tracking, and classifying submarines that were pioneered by those early operators were refined and automated, but never completely replaced. Even today, with all the advances in signal processing and artificial intelligence, the trained human ear remains an essential component of submarine detection. The story of musicians as sonar operators also provides a powerful reminder that war requires diverse skills and abilities. The same society that produces concert violinists and jazz pianists must also be prepared to transform those talents into tools of survival when necessary. The young man who spent years perfecting his technique on the piano could become, through training and necessity, someone who could hear submarines that no one else detected. This transformation came at a cost. Some of those young musicians never made it home, lost when their ships were torpedoed by the very submarines they were hunting. Others returned physically whole but carrying invisible scars, their relationship with sound forever changed by what they had heard in the dark waters of the North Atlantic. But their contribution was immeasurable. In a war where victory depended on the Allies' ability to move supplies across the ocean, where the defeat of the U-boats was essential to eventual success, the sonar operators played a crucial role. Their extraordinary ears, trained through years of musical practice and then honed to an even finer edge by intensive military training, became weapons that helped turn the tide of the Battle of the Atlantic. Technical challenges and innovations. The challenges faced by sonar operators went beyond simply having good hearing. The acoustic environment of submarine warfare was extraordinarily complex, and operators had to develop sophisticated mental models to interpret what they heard. Water temperature was one of the most significant variables. Sound travels faster in warm water than in cold water. When a sonar beam passed from one temperature layer to another, it would bend, just as light bends when passing through water. This bending could create shadow zones where submarines could hide, invisible to sonar, even though they were nearby. Experienced operators learned to predict where these shadow zones would be. They understood that in the North Atlantic, where cold water from the Arctic met warm water from the Gulf Stream, temperature layers were common and complex. They learned to search for submarines not just in the obvious places, but in the acoustic shadows where a clever U-boat captain might hide. Salinity also affected sound propagation. Areas where fresh river water met salt ocean water created acoustic boundaries. Rain falling on the surface created a layer of fresh water that could reflect sonar beams. Operators had to recognize these conditions and compensate for them. The depth of the ocean mattered too. In shallow coastal waters, sound would bounce off the bottom, creating multiple echoes that could confuse the picture. In deep ocean, operators had to deal with reverberation, the prolonged ringing that occurred after each sonar ping, as the sound reflected off countless small objects and temperature variations. Biological sounds presented constant challenges. The ocean was far from silent. Whales produced sounds that range from low-frequency rumbles that could travel hundreds of miles to high-frequency clicks used for echolocation. Dolphins chattered and whistled. Fish made surprisingly loud sounds, especially certain species whose swim bladders resonated at frequencies close to those used by sonar. Operators learned to distinguish these biological sounds from mechanical ones, but it was not always easy. A whale at close range could sound remarkably similar to a submarine. Schools of fish could create layered echoes that mimicked the return from a steel hull. The deep scattering layer, a mysterious phenomenon caused by countless small organisms rising and falling through the water column with the sun, created echoes that baffled early operators until they learned to recognize and ignore it. Ships themselves were sources of noise that could interfere with sonar detection. Propellers created turbulence and cavitation, bubbles forming and collapsing in the water, producing a roar that could drown out submarine echoes. Engines created vibrations that transmitted through the hull into the water. Auxiliary machinery, pumps, generators, all contributed to the ship's acoustic signature. The faster a ship moved, the louder it became, and the harder it was to hear anything else. This created a fundamental tactical dilemma. Moving slowly allowed better sonar detection, but made the ship an easier target for submarines. Moving fast reduced the risk of being torpedoed, but made it nearly impossible to hear approaching U-boats. Commanders had to balance these competing considerations, often relying on the sonar operator's judgment about whether conditions were good enough for effective detection at higher speeds. Weather added another layer of complexity. Heavy seas created noise at the surface, masking sounds from below. Rain could form an acoustic barrier. Wind-driven bubbles under the surface scattered sonar beams. Yet these same conditions often provided cover for submarine attacks, so operators had to maintain their vigil, even when conditions were terrible. The human factor. Despite all the technological advances, the human operator remained the most critical component of the sonar system. Machines could send pulses and receive echoes, but only a trained human ear and mind could interpret those echoes in the context of a complex and ever-changing acoustic environment. Operators developed what they described as a feel for the ocean's mood. They learned to recognize when conditions were good for detection, when the acoustic environment was clear and stable. They also learned to recognize when conditions were poor, when temperature layers and biological noise would make detection difficult or impossible. This knowledge allowed them to adjust their search patterns to know when a lack of contacts might mean no submarines were present, or might simply mean the submarines were hiding in acoustic shadows. The best operators developed a kind of acoustic intuition. After thousands of hours of listening, after processing countless echoes, their brains learned to recognize patterns at a level below conscious awareness. They would suddenly become alert, convinced they had detected something, unable to explain exactly what they had heard that triggered their response. Often these hunches proved correct. This intuitive understanding could not be fully taught. It came only with experience. A new operator, no matter how good his hearing or how complete his training, needed months at sea, before he developed this deeper level of acoustic awareness. The Navy tried to ensure that every ship had at least one experienced operator who could guide and train newer men, passing on not just technical knowledge, but this harder-to-define intuitive understanding. Fatigue was a constant enemy. During extended operations, especially when a convoy was under attack, operators might remain at their posts for 12 hours or more. As exhaustion set in, concentration wavered. Operators might start hearing things that were not there, phantom contacts born of fatigue and stress, or worse, they might miss real contacts because their brains were too tired to process the subtle clues in the acoustic data. The Navy tried to manage this by rotating operators on a regular schedule, ensuring that someone was always fresh. But in combat conditions, when submarines were known to be nearby, experienced operators often refused to be relieved, fearing that a less skilled replacement might miss a critical contact. They would push through the exhaustion, sustained by adrenaline, and the knowledge that lives depended on their vigilance. The final score. When the war ended in May 1945, the statistics told a story of transformation. In early 1942, the Allies had been losing the Battle of the Atlantic. U-boats roamed almost freely, sinking ships faster than they could be replaced. By late 1944, the situation had completely reversed. The U-boats were the hunted, rather than the hunters, suffering unsustainable losses. The final tally was sobering. German U-boats had sunk 4,773 Allied merchant ships, totaling over 21 million tons of shipping. They had sent tens of thousands of sailors to the bottom of the sea. The cost in lives and material was almost incomprehensible. But the Allies had prevailed. Of the roughly 1,100 German submarines that saw service during the war, 785 were destroyed. Many of those were sunk as a direct result of sonar detection. Thousands of attacks were prevented when U-boats, knowing they had been detected, chose to break off rather than press home and attack. The human cost on the German side was even more staggering. Of the approximately 40,000 men who served in U-boats during the war, 28,000 died. The submarine service had the highest casualty rate of any branch of any military during the war. Part of this terrible toll was due to the effectiveness of Allied anti-submarine warfare, and sonar detection was a key component of that effectiveness. Behind these numbers were the contributions of countless sonar operators, many of them former musicians who sat in darkened compartments hour after hour, watching after watch, listening to the endless symphony of the sea, waiting for the one sound that mattered. When that sound came, their trained ears and minds would process it, translate it into information, and set in motion the chain of events that would end with depth charges, splashing into the water above a doomed submarine. Conclusion: the story of musicians as sonar operators during World War II is a reminder that war tests societies in unexpected ways. The skills needed for victory are not always the ones that seem most obviously martial. Sometimes the ability to hear the difference between C-sharp and D-flat matters more than the ability to fire a rifle accurately. It is also a story about the adaptability of human beings, about how training and skills developed for one purpose can be transformed to meet an entirely different need. Young men who had devoted their lives to creating beautiful sounds with instruments learned to listen for the sounds of death beneath the sea. The same ears that once distinguished between subtle gradations of musical tone learned to distinguish between the echo of a submarine and the echo of a whale. For many of these men, their service was a source of lifelong pride mixed with complex emotions. They had used their gifts to help win the war, to protect their fellow sailors, to defeat an enemy that had threatened civilization itself. But they had also participated in the taking of lives, had listened as enemy submarines died, had heard sounds no one should ever have to hear. Some returned to music after the war and found it enriched by their experiences. Their understanding of sound deepened in ways they could never have imagined. Others found they could no longer bear to make music, the association between sound and war too painful to overcome. All of them carried memories that set them apart from those who had not served, who had not sat in the darkness, wearing headphones, listening for submarines. The technology of submarine detection has advanced enormously since World War II. Modern sonar systems use sophisticated signal processing, artificial intelligence, and acoustic arrays that would have seemed like science fiction to the operators of 1943. But the fundamental principle remains the same. Someone must listen. Someone must interpret. Someone must hear what others cannot hear. And when modern submarine crews train, when they learn their craft, they are taught to respect the power of the trained human ear. They learn that even the most sophisticated equipment cannot fully replace human intelligence and intuition, that the best sensor system in the world is only as good as the person operating it. The story of the musicians who became submarine hunters is not widely known. There are no monuments to them, no popular movies about their exploits. They served in the shadows, in darkened compartments, their victories measured in attacks that never happened, in convoys that arrived safely because submarines were detected and driven off before they could strike. But their contribution was real and significant. In the vast technological and industrial effort that was World War II, in a conflict decided by radar and atomic bombs and thousands of aircraft, there was also room for something quieter, something more subtle. There was room for the trained ear, for the musician's ability to hear what others could not, for the transformation of musical skill into a weapon of war. The young violinist from Philadelphia, the piano teacher from Boston, the jazz drummer from New Orleans, and thousands of others like them helped win the Battle of the Atlantic, not with guns or bombs, but with their ears. They listened, they heard, they made the difference. And because they did, the convoys got through, Britain survived, and the war was eventually won. In the end, it was a story as old as warfare itself. The right person, with the right skills, in the right place at the right time. But it was also a uniquely modern story, a tale of how the arts and sciences could combine, how musical training and military technology could merge to create something neither could achieve alone. The pings have long since faded. The men who sent them out and listened for their return are mostly gone now. But their legacy remains, a testament to human ingenuity and adaptability. A reminder that victory sometimes comes from the most unexpected places, and that sometimes, in the midst of the terrible thunder of war, the most important sound of all is the one that only a trained musician can hear.